The clouds hung low over the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks, dark and ominous as Cecilia Reynolds clutched her tattered shawl around her trembling shoulders. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the rain that had begun to fall, soaking her once fine dress to the skin. Her entire life lay shattered around her, as broken as the small wooden chest at her feet, the one possession she had managed to keep when the conductor discovered her ticket was a forgery and tossed her unceremoniously from the train. San Antonio, Texas, 1879, was no place for a woman alone, especially one with no money and nowhere to go. The small town depot had emptied quickly as the storm approached, leaving Cecilia utterly alone with her misery and fear. Her soft sobs were drowned out by the rumble of thunder as darkness began to fall. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. Looking up through rain-soaked lashes, she saw a tall figure on horseback, silhouetted against the darkening sky. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the muddy ground. "Madam? You all right?" His voice was deep, with a gentle drawl that somehow cut through the sound of the rain. Cecilia tried to compose herself, hastily wiping at her tears. "I'm fine, thank you," she lied, her voice breaking on the last word. The stranger stepped closer, and she could see him more clearly now, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh Texas sun. His eyes were a startling blue beneath the brim of his worn Stetson, and they were filled with concern as they took in her bedraggled appearance. "You don't look fine to me," he said, removing his hat and revealing thick brown hair streaked with gold. "I'm Thomas Blackwood. Most folks call me Tucker." "Cecilia Reynolds," she replied, her upbringing compelling her to maintain at least a veneer of propriety despite her circumstances. Tucker Blackwood glanced at the small chest at her feet, then back at the empty train platform. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "They put you off the train?" Shame burned through her, but she nodded, too exhausted to fabricate a more dignified explanation. Without another word, Tucker picked up her chest and secured it to his saddle. Then he turned back to her, his expression resolute. "You're coming home with me," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. Cecilia stiffened. "Sir, I couldn't possibly, madam. There's a storm coming, and it's going to be a bad one. My ranch is 5 miles from here. I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins, who'll see you're properly looked after. Unless you've got someplace else to go." They both knew she didn't. Cecilia hesitated, weighing her options, which were precisely none. "I promise you'll be safe," Tucker added, his voice softening. "No one should be alone on a night like this." A bolt of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The decision was made for her. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice barely audible over the increasingly heavy rainfall. Tucker nodded once, then in a single motion lifted her onto his horse before mounting behind her. His arms came around her as he took the reins, his chest warm against her back. "Hold on tight," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Stormy doesn't much care for lightning." As they rode away from the station, Cecilia couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. But as the rain pelted down, and the wind howled around them, the solid strength of the stranger behind her was the only comfort in a world that had suddenly become frighteningly uncertain. The storm grew fiercer as they rode, the wind whipping rain into their faces despite Tucker's broad-brimmed hat. Cecilia could feel him urging the horse to greater speed, one strong arm still secure around her waist. She had never been this close to a man she wasn't related to, and despite her distress, she was acutely aware of his proximity, the clean scent of him beneath the earthy smell of rain, the steady rise and fall of his chest against her back. "Not much further now," Tucker called over the wind. "Just beyond that ridge." Cecilia squinted through the rain, and could just make out the silhouette of a large house against the darkening sky. Relief flooded through her at the sight of shelter, though anxiety quickly followed. What was she doing, going home with a stranger? Her mother would be scandalized. But then, her mother had never found herself penniless and alone at a train station in the middle of nowhere. As they crested the ridge, Cecilia gasped. Below them spread a ranch far more substantial than she had expected, a large, two-story house with a wide front porch, several outbuildings, and corrals where horses huddled against the storm. Light glowed welcomingly from the windows, and even through the rain, she could tell this was no humble homestead but the seat of a prosperous operation. Tucker guided his horse down the slope and across the yard to a large barn. "We'll get Stormy settled first," he explained as he dismounted and reached up to help her down. His hands spanned her waist as he lifted her effortlessly to the ground. For a moment they stood facing each other, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and Cecilia felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "This way," Tucker said, breaking the moment as he led the horse into the barn. Inside was warm and dry, smelling of hay and leather. Tucker worked quickly, removing Stormy's saddle and bridle, rubbing the animal down with practiced efficiency. Cecilia stood awkwardly to one side, shivering in her wet clothes. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, uncertain how to express her gratitude without seeming forward. "Tucker," he corrected, throwing a blanket over the horse's back. "Mr. Blackwood was my father." "Tucker," she amended. "I don't know how to thank you." He paused in his work, those startling blue eyes finding hers in the lantern light. "No need for thanks. Couldn't leave you out there, could I?" He retrieved her small chest from where he'd secured it to the saddle. "Let's get you inside and dried off before you catch your death." They dashed through the rain to the back door of the house, which opened into a large, warm kitchen. A plump, gray-haired woman looked up from the stove, her expression changing from surprise to concern as she took in Cecilia's bedraggled state. "Land sakes, Tucker! Who's this poor soul?" "Mrs. Wilkins, this is Miss Cecilia Reynolds. Found her stranded at the station. Miss Reynolds, my housekeeper, Mrs. Abigail Wilkins." The older woman wiped her hands on her apron and came forward. "You're soaked through, child. Tucker, go fetch some dry clothes from Clara's room while I heat some water for a bath." Tucker nodded and disappeared through a door, leaving Cecilia with the motherly housekeeper. "Clara is Tucker's sister," Mrs. Wilkins explained as she bustled about, stoking the fire and putting a large kettle on to heat. "She's back east at school, but she's about your size, I'd say. Now come sit by the fire before you catch a chill." Cecilia sank gratefully onto a chair near the kitchen's large fireplace. The warmth began to seep into her bones, and she felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. "This is very kind of you, Mrs. Wilkins." "Nonsense. Can't have you catching pneumonia." The older woman paused in her work. "If you don't mind my asking, what were you doing out at the station alone?" Before Cecilia could formulate a response, Tucker returned with an armful of clothing. "Found these in Clara's room. Should fit well enough until your things dry out." "Thank you," Cecilia said, accepting the bundle of soft fabric. "I'll show you to the bathroom," Mrs. Wilkins said. "Tucker, that stew's nearly ready. Why don't you set the table while I help Miss Reynolds get settled?" Tucker nodded and began gathering plates from a nearby cupboard as Mrs. Wilkins led Cecilia from the kitchen. The bathroom was a luxury Cecilia hadn't expected to find on a ranch in the Texas countryside, a proper room with a large copper tub, running water pumped from a windmill, and even a small stove to heat the room. Mrs. Wilkins filled the tub with steaming water and added a few drops of lavender oil. "Take your time, dear," the housekeeper said kindly. "I'll have some hot food waiting when you're done. We can talk about what brought you here after you've had a chance to warm up and fill your stomach." Left alone, Cecilia sank into the hot water with a sigh of relief. As she washed away the grime of travel and the salt of her tears, she tried to make sense of the dramatic turn her life had taken. Just this morning, she had been fleeing in desperation. Now she was bathing in a stranger's home, about to dine with a man she had met less than 2 hours ago. Tucker Blackwood. Her rescuer. A man with kind eyes and strong hands who had lifted her from despair as easily as he had lifted her onto his horse. What would tomorrow bring? For the first time in weeks, Cecilia found herself curious about the future rather than dreading it. After dressing in the borrowed clothes, a simple but well-made blue dress that fit remarkably well, Cecilia made her way back to the kitchen, following the enticing aroma of beef stew and freshly baked bread. Her hair was still damp, hanging loose down her back in a way that would have been considered scandalously informal in her former life. But her former life seemed very far away at the moment. Tucker and Mrs. Wilkins were seated at the kitchen table, which had been set with simple but fine china. They both rose when she entered. "Feeling better?" Tucker asked, pulling out a chair for her. "Much, thank you," Cecilia replied, taking the offered seat. "I can't remember the last time I felt so clean." Mrs. Wilkins ladled stew into bowls and passed them around, along with a basket of warm bread. "Eat up now. Nothing settles the spirit like a full stomach." The food was delicious, hearty, and flavorful in a way that reminded Cecilia of her childhood before her family's fortunes had changed. She ate with more appetite than she had shown in weeks, suddenly aware of how hungry she had been. "So, Miss Reynolds," Tucker said after they had eaten in companionable silence for a few minutes, "what brings you to this part of Texas? You don't sound like you're from around here." Cecilia hesitated, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. Should she tell them the truth? Part of the truth? What would they think of her if they knew? "I was born in Virginia," she began cautiously. "My father was a landowner there. After the war, things changed." Tucker nodded, understanding in his eyes. Many Southern families had lost everything after the Civil War. "My father passed away 2 years ago," Cecilia continued, finding it easier to speak once she had begun. "There were debts I wasn't aware of. My mother remarried last year a banker from Boston named Gerald Harrington." She set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly diminished. "Mr. Harrington was not the gentleman he presented himself as. After the wedding, She faltered, unable to describe the cruel man who had made her mother's life miserable and had begun to look at Cecilia in ways that made her skin crawl. "You don't have to explain," Tucker said quietly. "Some men don't deserve the title." Cecilia gave him a grateful look. "My mother fell ill this past winter. Pneumonia. She didn't recover. After the funeral, Mr. Harrington informed me that since I was not his daughter, I was no longer welcome in his home. He gave me enough money for a train ticket and suggested I find relatives who might take me in." "That's terrible," Mrs. Wilkins exclaimed. "A young lady like yourself, put out with nowhere to go." "I was traveling to San Francisco," Cecilia explained. "My mother's cousin lives there. But I was robbed in St. Louis. Someone took my purse with most of my money and my ticket while I was sleeping on the train. I used what little I had left to buy another ticket, but it only got me as far as here." She looked down at her hands. "The conductor discovered it wasn't valid for the full journey to San Francisco." Tucker's expression darkened. "And he put you off the train in the middle of a storm?" "Without making sure you had somewhere to go." Cecilia nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I suppose he was just doing his job." "His job doesn't include leaving women stranded in bad weather," Tucker said firmly. "Well, you're safe now, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need to." "I couldn't impose," Cecilia began. "Nonsense," Mrs. Wilkins interrupted. "This house is too big for just Tucker and me. Clara's room is sitting empty, and it would be nice to have another woman around the place. But I have no way to pay you," Cecilia protested. Tucker leaned back in his chair, studying her with those intense blue eyes. "Can you read and write?" Surprised by the question, Cecilia nodded. "Yes, of course. I was educated at Miss Porter's School for Young Ladies in Virginia." A smile tugged at the corner of Tucker's mouth. "Then perhaps we can help each other. I've been looking for someone to help with the books and correspondence for the ranch. Mrs. Wilkins handles what she can, but with the business growing, it's becoming too much. Would you be willing to work as my secretary, in exchange for room and board?" Cecilia stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would trust me with your business affairs? You don't even know me. Tucker's gaze was steady. I'm a good judge of character, Miss Reynolds. I don't think you're the type to steal from me or run off with ranch secrets to my competitors. His expression softened. Besides, everyone deserves a second chance. Tears pricked at Cecilia's eyes, but these were tears of relief, not despair. Thank you, she whispered. I accept your offer, and I promise I'll work hard to earn my keep. Then it's settled, Tucker said, rising from the table. Mrs. Wilkins will show you to Clara's room. We can discuss your duties tomorrow after you've had a good night's rest. As Cecilia followed Mrs. Wilkins up the stairs to what would be her new room, she couldn't help glancing back at the tall cowboy who had so unexpectedly changed her fate. He stood by the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantel, watching her go with an expression she couldn't quite read. For the first time in months, Cecilia felt something like hope unfurling in her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, her luck had finally changed. Cecilia woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment she lay disoriented, the events of the previous day flooding back in a rush: the humiliation at the train station, the storm, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger. Tucker Blackwood. The man who had brought her to his home and offered her a position when she had nothing. The room she'd been given was lovely, spacious and feminine without being fussy, with a large bed, a dresser with a mirror, and a small desk by the window. Clara Blackwood, whoever she was, had good taste. Cecilia's own possessions were pitifully few, just the contents of the small chest Tucker had retrieved from the station. A few changes of clothing, a miniature portrait of her parents, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. All that remained of her former life. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Miss Reynolds? Are you awake? Mrs. Wilkins called. Yes, please come in, Cecilia answered, sitting up and smoothing her borrowed nightgown. The housekeeper entered carrying a tray. Brought you some breakfast. Thought you might want to eat before facing the day. That's very thoughtful, thank you. Cecilia accepted the tray, which held a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, along with a steaming cup of coffee. Mrs. Wilkins bustled around the room, opening the curtains wider. Your clothes are washed and pressed. I've hung them in the wardrobe there. Not much to work with, but we'll manage until we can get you some more things. I couldn't possibly ask for more than you've already given me, Cecilia protested. The older woman waved a dismissive hand. Tucker's already mentioned riding into town later this week to pick up some fabric and essentials for you. Said it's a business expense since you'll be representing the Blackwood Ranch now. Cecilia felt a blush creep up her cheeks. He's being far too generous. Mrs. Wilkins gave her a knowing look. Tucker has his reasons. He knows what it's like to be down on your luck. She moved toward the door. He's waiting for you in his study when you're ready. Down the hall to your left, last door. After finishing her breakfast and dressing in her freshly laundered clothes, a simple gray skirt and white blouse that had seen better days, Cecilia made her way to Tucker's study. She hesitated before knocking, suddenly nervous about her new position. Come in, called Tucker's deep voice. The study was a handsome room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large oak desk covered in papers. Maps of the surrounding countryside hung on one wall, while the other featured a large window overlooking the ranch. Tucker stood by this window, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light. He turned as she entered, and Cecilia was struck again by those remarkable blue eyes. Good morning, Miss Reynolds. I trust you slept well? Very well, thank you. She clasped her hands in front of her, uncertain of the protocol. Mrs. Wilkins said you wanted to see me about my duties. Tucker gestured to a chair in front of the desk. Please sit down. He took his own seat and pushed aside a stack of papers. Before we discuss your work, there's something I should explain about my situation. Cecilia sat, folding her hands in her lap, curious about what he might reveal. This ranch, Tucker began, wasn't always mine. I came to Texas 10 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a desire to make something of myself. I was hired as a ranch hand by Abraham Foster, who owned this place then. He looked around the study, his expression reflective. Foster had no children of his own. His wife had died years before I arrived. I worked hard, learned everything I could about ranching, and eventually became his foreman. When he passed away 3 years ago, he left the ranch to me. That was extraordinarily generous of him, Cecilia said. Tucker nodded. It was. Not everyone in the area was pleased about it. Some felt the ranch should have gone to relatives back east, even though they'd never set foot in Texas. Others thought I must have tricked an old man somehow. He met her eyes directly. I tell you this so you understand that the Blackwood name doesn't have the history that some others do around here. Everything I have, I've built or been given through Foster's kindness. I understand, Cecilia said, beginning to see why he might have been so quick to help someone down on their luck. You're offering me the same chance Mr. Foster gave you. A smile touched Tucker's lips. In a much smaller way, yes. Now, about your duties. He explained that the ranch was growing rapidly, with increasing cattle sales to markets in the north and investments in breeding stock to improve the herd. There was correspondence to maintain with buyers, supply orders to track, payroll for the ranch hands, and accounts to balance. I can handle all of that, Cecilia assured him, relieved that the tasks were well within her capabilities. Her father had insisted she understand business matters, an unusual education for a young lady but one she was now grateful for. Good, Tucker said, standing up. I'll show you around the property today so you understand what we do here. Tomorrow you can start organizing this mess. He gestured to the piles of papers on his desk with a rueful smile. The tour of the Blackwood Ranch took most of the day. Tucker showed her everything: the main house with its comfortable rooms, the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived, the barn and stables, the blacksmith's forge, and the corrals where young horses were being trained. They rode out on horseback to see some of the pasture land, stopping on a rise that overlooked a vast expanse of Texas countryside. All this is yours? Cecilia asked, impressed by the scale of the operation. 5,000 acres, Tucker confirmed, pride evident in his voice. Not the biggest spread in Texas, but it's good land with plenty of water. He pointed to a distant line of trees. The creek that runs through there never goes dry, even in the worst droughts. Cecilia studied him as he surveyed his domain. In the bright sunlight, she could see the fine lines around his eyes from years of squinting against the sun, the strong jawline shadowed with stubble, the way his shirt stretched across broad shoulders that spoke of hard physical work. He was not handsome in the polished way of the men she had known back east, but there was something compelling about his rugged features and direct gaze. How old are you, Mr. Blackwood? The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. If he was surprised by her forwardness, he didn't show it. 32 next month. And you, Miss Reynolds? 22, she replied, blushing slightly. Though sometimes I feel much older. Tucker's expression softened. Life has a way of aging us beyond our years sometimes. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, making their way back toward the ranch house. As they approached, Cecilia noticed activity in the yard, several men loading supplies into a wagon. Preparations for the cattle drive, Tucker explained, following her gaze. We'll be taking 300 head to the railhead at Abilene next week. You're leaving? Cecilia couldn't keep the note of alarm from her voice. The thought of Tucker's absence made her realize how quickly she had come to depend on his presence. For about 3 weeks, he confirmed. But Mrs. Wilkins will be here, and my foreman, Pete Callahan, checks on the ranch every day. You'll be safe. It wasn't safety she was concerned about, Cecilia realized with surprise. It was the thought of not seeing Tucker each day that troubled her. How strange, to feel such attachment to someone she had known for barely 24 hours. I'll use the time to get your office in order, she said, covering her momentary discomfort. You'll hardly recognize it when you return. Tucker grinned, a transformation that lit up his entire face and made her heart skip a beat. I'm counting on it, Miss Reynolds. As they dismounted at the stables, one of the ranch hands approached a tall, lanky man with a weathered face and a friendly smile. "Pete," Tucker called. "Come meet our new ranch secretary. Miss Cecilia Reynolds, this is Pete Callahan, the best foreman in Texas." "Pleasure to meet you, madam," Pete said, touching the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch." "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." Cecilia offered her hand, which Pete shook with careful respect. "Pete's been with the ranch longer than I have," Tucker explained. "Taught me most of what I know about cattle." "Boss gives me too much credit," Pete demurred. "He took to ranching like a duck to water." He turned back to Tucker. "Supply list is ready for your approval. We're still short on coffee and salt for the drive. I'll look it over after supper," Tucker promised. "Anything else I should know?" "New hand arrived while you were out. Young fellow named Daniel Wilson. Says he has experience with trail drives. Put him to work with the horses," Tucker decided. "We'll see what he's made of before the drive." As Pete headed back to the men, Tucker offered Cecilia his arm. "Shall we head in? Mrs. Wilkins will have supper ready soon, and I'd like to introduce you to the account books before dark." Cecilia placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt. "I've enjoyed seeing the ranch," she said sincerely. "You've built something impressive here." Tucker looked down at her, something warm in his gaze that made her breath catch. "I'm glad you approve, Miss Reynolds." As they walked toward the house together, Cecilia felt a curious sense of belonging, as if she had found a place in this vast Texas landscape where she might put down roots. It was far too soon for such thoughts, she knew. And yet she couldn't help but wonder if fate had guided her to this very spot, to this very man, for a reason. The next week passed in a blur of activity. True to her word, Cecilia tackled the chaos of Tucker's office with determination, creating filing systems for correspondence, organizing the accounts into proper ledgers, and establishing a schedule for managing the ranch's business affairs. She discovered she had a talent for the work, or perhaps it was simply that she wanted to prove her worth to the man who had rescued her. Tucker himself was constantly busy with preparations for the cattle drive, but he made time each evening to review her progress and answer her questions. These quiet hours in the study became the highlight of Cecilia's day. Tucker was an attentive listener and seemed genuinely impressed with her organizational skills and quick mind. "You're a natural at this," he told her one evening as they went over the ranch's finances. "Abraham would have hired you in a heartbeat." "Tell me more about him," Cecilia said, curious about the man who had seen such potential in Tucker. Tucker leaned back in his chair, a fond expression crossing his face. "Abraham Foster was the toughest, fairest man I ever met. Fought in the Mexican War, then came to Texas with nothing but a dream of raising cattle. Built this place from the ground up." He gestured around them. "Never had children of his own, which I think he regretted. His wife, Sarah, died before I arrived, but from the way he spoke of her, they had a real love match." "Is that why you never married?" Cecilia asked. "Because you saw how much he missed his wife?" Tucker looked surprised by the question. "Partly, perhaps. Mostly I've been too busy building the ranch to think about a family." He gave her a curious look. "What about you? Was there someone back east?" Cecilia shook her head. "There was a young man my parents approved of, but after my father died and our circumstances changed, his interest waned." She tried to keep the bitterness from her voice. "It's remarkable how quickly one's prospects diminish along with one's fortune." "His loss," Tucker said simply, and the conviction in his voice made her cheeks warm. The day before Tucker was set to leave on the cattle drive, he took Cecilia into town. San Antonio was larger and more bustling than she had expected, with a mix of American, Mexican, and European influences evident in its architecture and the faces of its people. Their first stop was the Mercantile, where Tucker insisted on purchasing fabric and notions for new dresses, as well as practical items like stockings, a warm shawl, and a sturdy pair of boots better suited to ranch life than her city shoes. Please let me repay you when I receive my first wages, Cecilia protested as the clerk wrapped their purchases. Consider it in advance, Tucker said firmly. Besides, you'll need proper clothes for when we attend the Cattlemen's Association dinner next month. We? Cecilia echoed, surprised. As my ranch secretary, you should be present for business discussions, Tucker explained, though there was something in his expression that suggested more than business interest. Their next stop was the bank, where Tucker introduced her to the manager, making it clear that she was authorized to conduct business on behalf of the ranch in his absence. The respect with which the banker treated her and Tucker indicated the Blackwood Ranch held significant standing in the community. As they walked back to their wagon, packages in hand, Tucker suddenly stopped outside a small jewelry shop. Wait here a moment, he said, disappearing inside before she could respond. He emerged a few minutes later with a small package, which he tucked into his pocket without explanation. Cecilia's curiosity was piqued, but she didn't feel it was her place to ask questions. They had lunch at a small cafe where the owner greeted Tucker like an old friend and insisted on serving them the day's special, a delicious beef stew with fresh baked bread that reminded Cecilia of her first meal at the ranch. Everyone seems to know you, she observed as they ate. Tucker shrugged. San Antonio isn't that big, and ranchers tend to stick together. Plus, I make a point of doing business locally when I can. The people respect you, Cecilia said. I can see it in how they treat you. Respect has to be earned, Tucker replied. It took time. When I first inherited the ranch, there were plenty who thought I wouldn't last a year. But you proved them wrong. A smile touched his lips. I did at that. As they finished their meal, Tucker grew more serious. While I'm gone, if you need anything at all, Pete or Mrs. Wilkins will help you. And if there's trouble, Sheriff Davis knows to keep an eye on the ranch. I'll be fine, Cecilia assured him, touched by his concern. Besides, I'll be too busy organizing your office to get into any trouble. Tucker hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew the small package from the jewelry store. I got you something. A small token to thank you for taking on this position. Surprised, Cecilia accepted the package and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a delicate silver pendant on a chain, a small star with a tiny diamond at its center. The Lone Star, Tucker explained. It seemed fitting, since Texas is your home now. It's beautiful, Cecilia whispered, deeply moved by the gesture. No one had given her a gift in a very long time, and certainly not one so thoughtful. Thank you. May I? Tucker asked, taking the necklace from its box. Cecilia nodded and turned slightly, lifting her hair so he could fasten the chain around her neck. His fingers were surprisingly gentle for such large hands, and she felt a shiver run through her at their brief touch against her skin. The necklace settled perfectly at the base of her throat, catching the light as she turned back to face him. Tucker's eyes were warm as they met hers. It suits you, he said softly. Something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but powerful. Cecilia felt her heartbeat quicken, and for an instant she thought Tucker might lean forward, might bridge the small distance between them. But the moment was broken by the arrival of the cafe owner with coffee, and the opportunity, if that's what it had been, passed. As they drove back to the ranch that afternoon, Cecilia found herself touching the star pendant, and wondering what might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted. And more troublingly, why the thought of Tucker leaving for 3 weeks suddenly felt like such a loss. The morning of the cattle drive dawned clear and cool. Cecilia rose early, wanting to see Tucker off, though she told herself it was merely proper courtesy to wish her employer a safe journey. She dressed carefully in one of her old dresses, saving the new fabrics for Mrs. Wilkins to help her sew later. The ranch yard was a flurry of activity, cowboys mounting up, chuck wagon being checked one last time, and the cattle gathered in the holding pens, their lowing creating a constant backdrop of noise. Tucker was in the thick of it, giving last-minute instructions to the men, checking saddle cinches, and conferring with Pete. He spotted Cecilia on the porch and made his way over to her, looking every inch the rancher in his work clothes, with a bandana around his neck and his well-worn Stetson shading his eyes. "You're up early," he remarked, stopping at the foot of the steps. "I wanted to wish you a safe journey," Cecilia said, suddenly feeling shy. 3 weeks is a long time. "It is," Tucker agreed, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing it. "I've left instructions with Pete about running the ranch. And there's a letter on my desk explaining some business matters that might come up while I'm gone." "I'll take good care of everything," she promised. Tucker hesitated, then climbed the steps to stand before her. "Cecilia," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I want you to know how much I appreciate what you've done already. The ranch hasn't run this smoothly in years." "I've hardly done anything yet," she protested. "You've done more than you know." His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "When I found you at that train station, I had no idea what a difference you would make to the ranch, and to me." Cecilia felt her heart flutter at his words. "Tucker, boss!" Pete's voice called from the yard. "We're ready to move out." Tucker sighed, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have to go. But I'll be thinking of you. Every day." Before Cecilia could respond, he reached out and took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that belonged more to a Southern gentleman than a Texas rancher. The brief touch of his mouth against her skin sent a wave of warmth through her entire body. "Take care of yourself," Tucker said, releasing her hand reluctantly. "I'll be back before you know it." He turned and strode back to his waiting horse, mounting in one fluid motion. With a final look at Cecilia, he raised his hand in farewell, then turned to the waiting cowboys. "Head 'em up! Move 'em out!" he called, and the great procession began to move, first the lead riders, then the massive herd of cattle, followed by the chuck wagon and the remaining cowboys. Cecilia stood on the porch long after they had disappeared from view, her hand still tingling where Tucker's lips had touched it, the star pendant warm against her skin. Only when Mrs. Wilkins called her in for breakfast did she finally turn away, her thoughts still with the tall cowboy who had ridden off with her heart, though either of them had yet recognized it. The days without Tucker stretched longer than Cecilia had anticipated. She threw herself into her work, determined to have the ranch's business affairs in perfect order by his return. Mrs. Wilkins proved to be a godsend, not only helping her sew new dresses from the fabric Tucker had purchased, but also teaching her the practical aspects of running a household in the Texas countryside. "A ranch wife needs to know these things," the housekeeper remarked one evening as she showed Cecilia how to make soap. "I'm hardly a ranch wife," Cecilia protested, blushing at the implication. "I'm just the secretary." Mrs. Wilkins gave her a knowing look but said nothing more on the subject. Pete Callahan checked him daily, bringing news of the ranch operations and occasionally reports from the cattle drive when riders returned with messages. The ranch hands who had remained behind were unfailingly polite, tipping their hats when they saw her and addressing her as Miss Reynolds, with evident respect. In the evenings, Cecilia explored the bookshelf in Tucker's study, discovering a surprising collection of literature alongside practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry. She found volumes of Shakespeare, Dickens, and even poetry by Tennyson and Wordsworth. One night she discovered a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, the same novel she cherished, with marginal notes in a neat, masculine hand that she recognized as Tucker's. The discovery of their shared literary interest delighted her. Near the end of the second week, as Cecilia was working in the study, a rider arrived in a cloud of dust. From the window, she saw Pete hurry to meet him, their conversation appearing urgent. When Pete came to the house a few minutes later, his expression was grim. "Trouble, Miss Reynolds," he said without preamble. "That was Jim returning from the drive. They've run into rustlers near the Red River. Lost about 30 head before they could drive them off. Was anyone hurt?" Cecilia asked, her heart constricting with worry for Tucker. "2 men wounded, not seriously. Tucker's fine," Pete added, correctly interpreting her concern. "But he's asking for reinforcements. I need to take 5 men and ride out tomorrow morning." "Of course," Cecilia said, relieved that Tucker was unharmed but worried about this new development. What do you need me to do? Nothing right now, madam. But with me gone, you'll need to keep a closer eye on things here. I've asked Ben Miller to step up as temporary foreman. He's young but reliable. That night, Cecilia found sleep elusive. She kept thinking about Tucker facing dangerous rustlers, possibly putting himself in harm's way to protect his cattle and men. The pendant he had given her seemed to grow heavier against her skin, a tangible reminder of the man who was never far from her thoughts. The next morning, she saw Pete and his men off at dawn, then set about her duties with renewed determination. If Tucker needed to focus on protecting the herd, she would ensure that everything at the ranch ran smoothly in his absence. 3 days later, Cecilia was working in the garden with Mrs. Wilkins when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw a lone rider coming fast down the road to the ranch, too fast for casual travel. Something's wrong, Mrs. Wilkins said, setting down her basket of vegetables. The rider, one of the younger ranch hands who had gone with Pete, reined in his horse in a spray of dust. Miss Reynolds! He called, his voice urgent. Mr. Blackwood's been shot. Cecilia felt the blood drain from her face. How bad? She managed to ask, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. Took a bullet in the shoulder, the young man reported. Doc out there says he'll live, but he's running a fever. They're bringing him home slow in the wagon. Should be here by nightfall. What happened to the rustlers? Mrs. Wilkins asked as Cecilia struggled to find her voice. We drove them off. Pete and the others are continuing with the herd to Abilene. Mr. Blackwood insisted they finish the drive. Of course he did, Mrs. Wilkins muttered. Stubborn as the day is long. She turned to Cecilia, who was still frozen in shock. Miss Reynolds, we need to prepare. I'll get Tucker's room ready and heat water for when they arrive. Can you gather clean linens and my medical supplies from the pantry? The practical tasks brought Cecilia back to herself. Yes, of course. She turned to the young cowboy. Thank you for bringing word. Please get something to eat and rest your horse before you head back. The hours until nightfall were the longest of Cecilia's life. She and Mrs. Wilkins prepared everything the doctor might need, then waited anxiously on the porch as the sun began to set. When they finally heard the rumble of wagon wheels, Cecilia had to restrain herself from running down the road to meet them. The wagon came into view, moving slowly in the gathering dusk. In the back, Cecilia could make out Tucker's still form, covered with blankets despite the warm evening. 2 ranch hands rode alongside, and another drove the team. As they pulled into the yard, Cecilia hurried to the wagon. Tucker lay pale and motionless, his normally tanned face flushed with fever. A blood-stained bandage was visible at his shoulder where his shirt had been cut away. Tucker, she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. His skin burned beneath her fingers. His eyes fluttered open at her touch, unfocused at first, then clearing as they found her face. Cecilia, he murmured, his voice weak but warm. You're a sight for sore eyes. Don't talk, she admonished gently. We need to get you inside. The ranch hands carefully lifted Tucker from the wagon and carried him into the house and up to his bedroom, where Mrs. Wilkins waited with hot water, bandages, and her collection of herbal remedies. The local doctor had done what he could in the field, but the journey had reopened the wound, and infection had clearly set in. I'll tend to him, Mrs. Wilkins said as the men laid Tucker on the bed. Miss Reynolds, perhaps you should wait downstairs. No, Cecilia said firmly. I'm staying. Tell me what to do. The housekeeper gave her an appraising look, then nodded. We'll need to clean the wound again and draw out the infection. It won't be pleasant. I'm not afraid, Cecilia said, and it was true. The only thing she feared at that moment was losing Tucker. Through the long night, they worked together, bathing Tucker's burning skin with cool water, applying poultices to the angry wound, and coaxing him to drink herbal teas when he was conscious enough to swallow. In his fevered state, Tucker muttered words that sometimes made no sense, but occasionally, He would say Cecilia's name with such tenderness that her heart would clench. Near dawn, his fever finally broke. Cecilia, who had refused to leave his side despite Mrs. Wilkins's insistence that she rest, was dozing in a chair when Tucker's voice, weak but clear, woke her. "You're still here," he said, his blue eyes clear of fever for the first time since his arrival. Cecilia moved to sit on the edge of the bed, taking his hand in hers. "Of course I am. Where else would I be?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You should be sleeping in your own bed, not keeping vigil over a foolish cowboy who got himself shot." "What happened?" she asked, gently stroking his hand with her thumb. Tucker's expression darkened. "Rustlers hit us again, bigger group this time. We were ready for them, but one got behind me." He tried to shift position and winced. "How bad is it?" "The bullet went through clean, but there was infection," Cecilia explained. "Mrs. Wilkins thinks you'll recover fully with rest." "I don't have time for rest," Tucker grumbled. "The herd is in good hands with Pete," Cecilia interrupted. "He sent word that they're making good time and should reach Abilene within the week." Tucker studied her face for a long moment. "You've been taking care of everything, haven't you?" "It's my job," she reminded him, though they both knew her devotion went far beyond employment. "Cecilia," Tucker began, his voice growing serious. "When I was out there, with that bullet in me and not sure if I'd make it back, there was only one thing I regretted." "What was that?" she asked softly, her heart pounding. "Not telling you how I feel before I left." His hand tightened around hers. "From the moment I found you at that train station, something changed for me. I've never believed in fate, but finding you there, in that storm, it feels like more than chance." Cecilia's breath caught in her throat. "Tucker, let me finish," he said gently. "I know it's too soon. We've known each other barely a month. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I'm falling in love with you, Cecilia Reynolds." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling onto her cheeks. "I thought I was imagining it," she whispered. "The way you looked at me, the things you said. I was afraid to hope." "You weren't imagining anything," Tucker assured her, reaching up with his good arm to brush away her tears. "I tried to tell myself it was too soon, that you needed time to settle here before I spoke. But lying out there under the stars, not knowing if I'd see you again. Life's too short for waiting when you're sure." "I'm falling in love with you too," Cecilia admitted, the words bringing with them a sense of rightness, of coming home. "I think I started falling the moment you lifted me onto your horse and said I was coming home with you." Tucker smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face despite his weakness. "Then I'm glad I found you crying beside those tracks, Miss Reynolds." He tugged gently on her hand, drawing her closer until their faces were inches apart. Cecilia hesitated only a moment before leaning down to press her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle but filled with promise. When she pulled back, Tucker was looking at her with such tenderness that it took her breath away. "You should rest now," she said, reluctantly moving to stand. Tucker kept hold of her hand. "Stay," he said simply. "Just until I fall asleep." Cecilia settled back in her chair, still holding his hand. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. And as Tucker drifted into healing sleep, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged, not just at Blackwood Ranch, but with the remarkable man who had rescued her in more ways than one. Tucker's recovery was slower than he would have liked but steady. Cecilia divided her time between managing the ranch affairs and tending to him, reading aloud from his books when he grew restless and discussing business matters when he felt strong enough. Their relationship deepened during these quiet hours together, as they shared stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. 2 weeks after Tucker's return, Pete Callahan and the rest of the hands rode in from Abilene, bringing news of a successful sale despite the loss of some cattle to the rustlers. The price had been higher than expected, and Pete proudly delivered a bank draft for a substantial sum. "You did well, Pete," Tucker said, reviewing the figures in the ranch office where he was finally able to sit up for short periods. Better than I could have hoped, given the circumstances. Miss Reynolds deserves some credit too, Pete replied with a nod toward Cecilia, who was updating the ledgers with the new information. Her telegram to the buyers explaining our situation helped secure that price. Said they appreciated our honesty about the reduced herd size and were willing to pay premium for quality stock. Tucker gave Cecilia a proud look. She's full of surprises, our Miss Reynolds. The "our" wasn't lost on Pete, who exchanged a knowing glance with Mrs. Wilkins as she brought in coffee. The entire household had observed the growing attachment between Tucker and Cecilia, though the couple themselves maintained a respectful distance in public. As Tucker's strength returned, he began taking short walks around the ranch with Cecilia at his side. On a particularly beautiful afternoon in late September, they strolled to a small rise overlooking a meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the advancing season. I used to come here often when I first arrived, Tucker said as they settled on a flat rock warmed by the sun. When I was just a ranch hand with nothing to my name. I'd sit and look out at all this land and dream about having a place of my own someday. And now you do, Cecilia said, admiring the vista before them. Tucker turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. I have the land, yes. But I've come to realize there's more to having a home than owning property. He took her hand, his touch now familiar but still thrilling. A home needs a heart, Cecilia. And you've brought that to Blackwood Ranch. Cecilia felt a blush rise to her cheeks. You've given me so much, Tucker. A place to belong when I had nowhere else to go. You've given me far more, he countered. Before you came, I was just existing, working from sunrise to sunset, building the ranch, but not really living. His blue eyes held hers intently. You changed that. You made me see that there's more to life than work. He shifted slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing shoulder. I had planned to do this differently, take you to San Antonio for dinner, perhaps, or at least wait until I could get down on one knee properly. Cecilia's heart began to race as she realized what he might be saying. But I nearly died out there, Tucker continued, his voice growing more serious. And it made me understand that we don't always have the luxury of perfect timing. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. I've been carrying this since before the cattle drive. Bought it that day in town. He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a gold band set with a single diamond that caught the afternoon sun and scattered it in rainbow fragments. I know it's fast. Too fast by proper standards. But nothing about our meeting was conventional, and I don't want to waste another day without asking you to be my wife. Tears blurred Cecilia's vision as Tucker took the ring from its box. Cecilia Reynolds, will you marry me? Will you make Blackwood Ranch your home, not as my secretary, but as my partner in everything? Yes, Cecilia whispered, her voice catching on the word. Yes, Tucker, I will marry you. His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. I love you, he said simply, drawing her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Cecilia rested her forehead against his. What will people say? We've known each other such a short time. Tucker chuckled. They'll say I'm the luckiest man in Texas, finding a beautiful, intelligent woman willing to take on a rough cowboy like me. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Besides, 3 months is practically a lifetime in frontier terms. 3 months? Cecilia echoed, confused. It hasn't even been 2 since you found me at the station. Tucker's expression grew sheepish. I may have already spoken to Reverend Williams about a November wedding. If that suits you, of course, he added hastily. We can wait longer if you prefer. Cecilia laughed, a sound of pure joy. November sounds perfect. That gives Mrs. Wilkins just enough time to help me finish my wedding dress. Tucker raised an eyebrow. You've been making a wedding dress? I might have been hoping, Cecilia admitted with a blush. Though I told Mrs. Wilkins it was just a special occasion dress. She wasn't fooled, I'm sure. Tucker stood and helped Cecilia to her feet. We should head back and share our news. Though I suspect it won't come as a surprise to anyone. Hand in hand, they walked back to the ranch house, where their announcement was indeed met with knowing smiles and heartfelt congratulations. Mrs. Wilkins immediately began planning the wedding feast, while Pete organized the ranch hands to build an addition to the house, a proper office for the ranch business, he explained, so that Tucker's study could become a shared space for the couple. Word spread quickly through the county, and while there were some raised eyebrows at the speed of the engagement, most people who knew Tucker understood that when he made up his mind, he didn't hesitate. Several neighboring ranchers and their wives came to call, curious to meet the Eastern lady who had captured the bachelor rancher's heart. Clara Blackwood, Tucker's sister, whose room Cecilia had been occupying, wrote from her school in Boston that she was delighted by the news and would arrive in time for the wedding. Her letter was warm and welcoming, expressing excitement about finally having a sister. As the wedding date approached, Cecilia found herself busier than ever. Between her duties as ranch secretary, preparations for the ceremony, and learning the finer points of running a Texas household from Mrs. Wilkins, she barely had time to contemplate the dramatic change her life had undergone in such a short period. One evening, as she sat on the porch swing with Tucker after supper, she voiced this thought aloud. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I would be in Texas, about to marry a rancher I met at a train station, I would have thought they were mad. Tucker put his arm around her, drawing her closer against the evening chill. Life has a way of surprising us. 6 months ago, I was convinced I'd remain a bachelor, married only to this land. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Now I can't imagine my life without you in it. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't ridden by the station that evening? Cecilia asked. If you'd taken a different route, or if the storm hadn't been coming? Tucker was quiet for a moment, considering. I believe we would have found each other somehow, he said finally. Some things are meant to be, Cecilia. Like you and me. She turned her face up to his, marveling at the certainty in his voice and the love in his eyes. As their lips met in a tender kiss, Cecilia knew he was right. Whatever forces had brought them together, chance, fate, or divine intervention, she was profoundly grateful for the storm that had led Tucker Blackwood to find her crying beside the tracks and declare, "You're coming home with me." The wedding took place on a crisp November day, with the Texas sky a brilliant blue overhead and a hint of winter in the air. The ceremony was held at the small church in San Antonio, followed by a celebration at Blackwood Ranch that brought together neighbors, friends, and the entire ranch staff. Cecilia wore a gown of ivory silk that she and Mrs. Wilkins had worked on for weeks, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once belonged to Tucker's mother. Clara Blackwood, a younger, feminine version of her brother with the same striking blue eyes, had arrived from Boston 3 days earlier and immediately bonded with her soon-to-be sister-in-law. She stood as Cecilia's maid of honor, while Pete Callahan served as Tucker's best man. The moment Tucker saw Cecilia walking down the aisle toward him, his face transformed with such naked adoration that several of the ladies in attendance dabbed at their eyes. Cecilia herself felt as though she were floating, scarcely able to believe that this handsome man waiting for her at the altar was to be her husband. The Reverend Williams, who had known Tucker since his days as a ranch hand, conducted the ceremony with evident pleasure. When he pronounced them man and wife, Tucker's kiss was both tender and possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed an army, thanks to Mrs. Wilkins's planning. As the newlyweds shared their first dance, Tucker held Cecilia close, his lips near her ear. "Happy Mrs. Blackwood?" he murmured. The name sent a thrill through her. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. Later, as they prepared to depart for a brief honeymoon in San Antonio, Tucker couldn't be away from the ranch for long. Cecilia found herself surrounded by the women of neighboring ranches, offering advice and good wishes. "You've got yourself a good man," said Mrs. Thompson, wife of the largest landowner in the county. "Been watching Tucker Blackwood build something from nothing these past years. Takes a special kind of determination." He's lucky to have found you," added Mrs. Davis, the sheriff's wife. "This country needs more women of refinement to balance all these rough cowboys." Cecilia smiled, thinking of how her Eastern refinement had given way to a much more practical approach to life since coming to Texas. "I'm the lucky one," she said. "Tucker gave me a home when I had nothing." The older women exchanged knowing glances. "That's how it starts," Mrs. Thompson said with a wink. "But mark my words, you'll be the one holding this place together before long. Behind every successful rancher is a wife with twice his sense." When they finally departed amid a shower of rice and good wishes, Tucker helped Cecilia into the buggy he had purchased especially for her use around the ranch, a wedding gift that she had admired in town weeks earlier. "Ready for our new life together?" he asked as they drove away, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. Cecilia looked back at the ranch house, glowing with lantern light against the darkening sky, then at her husband's beloved face. "I think our new life began the moment you found me at that train station," she said softly. "Everything since has just been the journey home." Tucker's smile was tender as he leaned over to kiss her. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood. Welcome home." 10 years later, Cecilia Blackwood stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, watching her husband demonstrate rope techniques to their eldest son, 8-year-old Abraham, named for the man who had given Tucker his start. Their 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, sat nearby, braiding wildflowers into a crown, while 4-year-old James toddled after a butterfly in the yard. The Blackwood Ranch had prospered beyond Tucker's wildest dreams in the decades since their marriage. With Cecilia's organizational skills and business acumen complementing Tucker's knowledge of ranching, they had expanded their holdings, improved their breeding stock, and established a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far away as Chicago. The small office Pete and the hands had built as a wedding present had long since been outgrown. Now a proper wing of the house was devoted to the ranch business, where Cecilia managed correspondence, accounts, and the increasing paperwork that came with their success. She had hired a young woman from town to assist her 3 days a week, allowing her more time with the children. Mrs. Wilkins was still with them, though she had semi-retired to a comfortable cottage Tucker had built for her near the main house. She doted on the children as if they were her own grandchildren and still insisted on supervising important meals and household events. Life hadn't always been easy. There had been drought years when they worried about water for the cattle, harsh winters that threatened the herd, and the usual challenges of building a life together. Tucker's shoulder sometimes ached in cold weather, a reminder of the bullet that had nearly taken him from her. But through it all, their love had only deepened, tempered by shared struggles and joys. As Cecilia watched her family in the yard, she absently touched the star pendant at her throat, the first gift Tucker had given her, and still her most treasured possession besides her wedding ring. She wore it every day as a reminder of where their journey together had begun. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Blackwood," came Tucker's voice as he approached the porch, leaving Abraham practicing with the rope. At 42, Tucker was still as handsome as the day she'd met him, though with more silver threading through his brown hair and additional laugh lines around his eyes. "Just counting my blessings," Cecilia replied with a smile. "And thinking about how differently my life might have turned out if a certain cowboy hadn't happened by the train station that day." Tucker came up the steps and drew her into his arms, a gesture as natural as breathing after 10 years of marriage. "Best decision I ever made, taking that route home," he murmured against her hair. "Though I think fate had a hand in it." "Fate, or an angel watching over a desperate young woman," Cecilia agreed, leaning into his embrace. Tucker tilted her face up to his. "I loved you from the first moment I saw you, you know. Standing there in the rain, so brave despite everything." "I wasn't brave," Cecilia corrected him. "I was terrified." "That's what makes it brave," Tucker insisted. "Being afraid but carrying on anyway." He kissed her gently. "Like taking a chance on a rough cowboy you just met." Cecilia laughed softly. "Best risk I ever took." From the yard came the sound of children's laughter as Abraham successfully twirled his rope, capturing his little brother in the loop to James's delighted squeals. Sarah abandoned her flower crown to join the game, her dark hair so like her mother's streaming behind her as she ran. "We should probably rescue James before he decides he wants to be a calf permanently," Tucker observed with a chuckle. "In a moment," Cecilia said, holding her husband close for just a little longer. "I'm not quite ready to let go yet." Tucker's arms tightened around her. "You never have to let go, Cecilia. Not ever again." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the family they had created, Cecilia reflected on the long, strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate young woman crying beside the railroad tracks to the confident wife, mother, and business partner she had become, it was a transformation she could never have imagined. And it had all begun with those simple words from a tall cowboy with kind blue eyes. "You're coming home with me." Every day since, she had been doing exactly that, coming home to the love that had saved her, transformed her, and given her a life more beautiful than any she could have dreamed.